Okay, folks, we are back. We are coming out of our quiet period. Our friends will be coming back down from ancillary sessions, but I want to get underway, not least because this will, of course, as with all of our sessions, be recorded and therefore will be available digitally, which is extremely apropos of the next topic. Digital freedom. In a moment, I will bring up a very estimable panel to discuss this issue. But first, if we could put up the next polling question, please. And there it is. Is access to the internet a human right? Fairly straightforward question, but interesting in its implications. Is access to the internet a human right? And if we could put up the number, so commit 10 to 90206. And I'll wait just a minute and see if we're going to get the results. So while we're waiting for those results, I'm going to introduce the moderator for our panel. She is Rebecca Busse. She is Senior Manager of Stakeholder Engagement with Future 500. And she is, they have put together a fantastic, a really interesting panel that I think you'll all find enlightening. I know I'm going to be sitting right there. And without further ado, Rebecca Busse.
Okay. Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Did we get the results on the poll yet? No? Okay. Thanks for participating. So I'm Rebecca Busse, and we do stakeholder engagement at Future 500. And often when I tell people that, they want to know, what does that mean? Stakeholder engagement has definitely become more of a buzzword in the past few years. You're all probably familiar with it. But how we see it at Future 500 is bringing people together. I loved Dov's talk this morning. Talking about human connection, because I think that when you get people in a room together, no matter how disparate their viewpoints are, if they can see each other as people, where they have common ground, we can make incredible change happen. Whether that's someone from an activist organization who feels very strongly about the rainforest, or someone from a big corporation who needs to protect the bottom line. So we're at an interesting juncture here. Wow, interesting. Half and half. So half of you all feel that the internet is a human right, and half of you don't. So we'll see how much that changes during the course of this panel. Hopefully it will change. It'll be interesting to see. So basically, we're at an interesting juncture in history. The internet allows for great freedom. Freedom to subvert the challenges, constraints of business, of civil society, even identity. But there are also risks involved with that. There's an anonymity involved in the internet that allows the darkness of humanity to surface sometimes. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Greed, abuse of power. So we have an interesting choice to make. There are people right now deciding the fate of the internet, from the technical aspects to the rules that govern it, who will use the internet, how it will be used. And so that's what we're going to talk about today a little bit, is we're making history right now, we're making culture. And everyone here, their lives are directly touched by the internet in many, many ways. And I know I'm preaching to the choir there. So let's bring up our panelists. We've got a great panel today. I'm really excited about it, and thanks for joining us. So first we have John Perry Barlow. Hi, guys. I'm going to read to you a little blurb on the Wikipedia page about John Perry, because he's a difficult one to introduce. There's so much to John Perry. So, an American poet and essayist, a retired Wyoming cattle rancher, and a cyber-libertarian political activist who has been associated with both the Democratic and Republican parties. There's kind of a lot to that. He's the co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he's also, and also a fellow at the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. John Perry. Harold Feld, to his left, your right. Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge, a group that preserves the openness of the internet and the public's access to knowledge. Harold writes widely on the issues associated with internet freedom. And he's on the U.S. delegation to Dubai for WICIT, which if you haven't heard of Wicket, we'll talk a little bit about it, but it's exciting that he's going to be there actually representing. Jim Harper, to his left, the Director of Information Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, a founding member of the Department of Homeland Security's Data Privacy and Integrity Advisory Committee, and also the author of Terrorizing Ourselves, How U.S. Counterterrorism Policy is Failing and How to Fix It. And Michael Petricone, last but not least, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs for the Consumer Electronics Association. And basically, he represents the organization before Congress and the FCC on issues such as digital television broadband and privacy. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's get comfortable here. So John Perry, happy birthday, by the way. It's his birthday today. Sorry to call you out in front of everyone.
Nice place you got here.
Yeah, it's not too shabby, right? Yeah. So basically, I just wanted to go through and ask you all, because as you probably know, it's difficult when talking about issues such as digital freedom. What does that mean? What does that mean to you? What does that mean to your organization? What does that mean to everyone in the audience? So I'd like to start by just first defining that and hearing your answers on that. So John Perry, would you begin?
Digital freedom is the same as the other kind. You know, it's freedom. I mean, I'm not sure how I would answer the poll, actually, because it's like saying, is the right to your voice box a human right? I mean, it's a way in which you communicate. And so I think digital freedom is different only insofar as it's much more easily amplified and it's much more easily abused. And moreover, it appears as a threat to practically every existing power relationship that has been on the planet for the last couple of thousand years. So it's tricky in that regard. And the other really, I think, important thing about digital freedom that makes it different from the other kind is that if you can control any aspect of the internet successfully, you can control it all.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that if you can be censorious about the thing that you find most unpalatable in your own precincts, then another entity somewhere else on the planet can be equally censorious of everything that you hold dear. And if the means have been developed for either one of you to do that, they've been developed for a lot of people that you wouldn't necessarily approve of doing that. So you end up, I mean, in my position, you end up having to defend, you know, kiddie pornographers and drug lords and terrorists and, you know, it's an unsavory lot, but that's what's required in order to maintain freedom in this environment.
All right. Harold, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that John is right. I usually frame the issue that he has talked about as the problem with the network is that my problem becomes everybody else's problem, and everybody else's problem becomes my problem. Because this only works at a level where we have genuine interconnection. And when you try to moderate that and filter it and censor it, you end up with problems not just within the area that's the target of the censorship, but rippling out through the entire network. At the same time, when people become destructive, and not just in the I'm putting out an idea that you don't like, but I've decided that I'm going to launch cyber attacks for whatever reason, then that problem becomes my problem as well. It puts something destructive out there in the broader network world, which eventually will rebound on me. I do want to just add a couple of things. One is one of the things that comes up when we talk about the internet as a human right and digital freedom is, does that mean access to the internet just if you can afford it, if you have it, or is there some responsibility on the part of governments in the same way that we have now thought of things like clean water, clean air, in some places access to medicine and health care as being human rights issues. And I do just feel the need to point out that going back to the 1930s, we made access to the telephone a fundamental right in the United States, that everybody ought to have it. And we had government regulation to ensure that people would get it. We had the same idea about electric power in the 1920s and 1930s. You still had to pay for it, but we came to regard it as one of those essential things in society that if you didn't have it, you were so disadvantaged that you effectively couldn't participate in society in the same way. And I think that we are seeing that increasingly that is the case with broadband access, both within the United States, where we're starting to see enormous differences in educational and economic opportunity with regard to if you have access or you don't, and globally. The challenge is how do you make that happen, and whether the solutions of the previous century are the solutions that we should have for this century's medium of communication, or whether there are other means by which we should aspire to have everybody have meaningful and genuine access to the digital world.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the regulation too. That's a big part of this whole discussion, so we'll definitely touch on that as well. And Jim, I know you feel very passionate about the very definition of digital freedom, so I'd love to hear your take on it.
Well, yeah, I think it's great in a discussion of digital freedom to start with what freedom is, and maybe to wax a little philosophical. There are many different versions of freedom that people use, and some of them aren't as free as others.
Or more free.
It's usually being free to do whatever you want.
We sort of, many libertarians in my school tie freedom back to what we call the anti-coercion principle. That is, it's wrong to coerce somebody else. That is, we're against private coercion. That's violence of all kinds. We're also against governmental coercion. And we believe that government is instituted to protect people from private coercion. And so maximizing government coercion just puts you maybe from the frying pan into the fire in some cases. The anti-coercion principle is basically that you cannot commit violence except in response to violence. We don't think about the violence in our society. We don't think about the coercion very often because most people do comply with the tax laws. Most people do comply with the regulations. But what's behind the tax laws and what's behind the regulation is coercion. So if you don't pay your taxes, if you don't run your network the way the FCC tells you, you're going to get a letter that says you really need to step up and start doing what we say. If you don't respond to the letter, after a while you're going to get a warrant. It's going to say you need to come down to court and explain yourself. If you don't respond to the warrant, someone's going to knock on your door, and they're going to put hands on you, and they're going to take you down to the jailhouse, and you're going to go before a judge, explain yourself, and if you fail to explain why you should be free, you're going to go to jail. That's coercion. And so that doesn't mean it should never happen in our society, but I think it's important to minimize it. And so digital freedom is exercise of the anti-coercion principle in all the realms that we're going to talk about: cybersecurity, the anonymity, things like that. A lot of people have solutions to internet problems. Connectivity, access to the internet is a genuine problem in some parts of the world, in some parts of the country. A lot of the solutions are based on coercion. And so you might be saying that's digital freedom. It's something other than digital freedom. You're valuing equality higher than freedom, and that's something worth debating.
Great, thank you. So Michael, you're talking to Congress, and they want to know what is digital freedom. So how would you describe it?
Sure. Let's start with the principle that innovation is inherently disruptive. And the internet is perhaps the primary example of this. Because of the internet, we've been running a business with a safe, comfortable business model for years, for decades. And all of a sudden, overnight, that business model is no longer adequate. It doesn't work. You've been running your country or your government in a certain way for years and years, and it's worked quite well. And overnight, because of the internet, all of a sudden your citizens are no longer satisfied. They want something different. It doesn't work. So the internet is an inherently disruptive medium. Nobody likes to be disrupted. Nobody likes change. It's human nature. If I told you that whatever you normally have for breakfast every morning, starting tomorrow, you're going to have something totally different, you wouldn't like that. We don't like change. It's uncomfortable. So there are always all kinds of interests, whether it's businesses or incumbent industries or the government, that will push back against the kind of change and disruption offered by the internet. And we at CEA spend a lot of time dealing with these issues. In Washington, D.C., there's a wonderful car service called Uber, an internet-based car service, which I would encourage everybody to try. It's fantastic. And at the behest of the D.C. Taxi Cab Commission, the D.C. City Council is trying to legislate it out of business. There's a wonderful new broadcast TV over the internet service called Aereo, which picks up broadcast TV over antennas and sends it over the internet. What's the issue? It's free over-the-air TV. The broadcasters are pushing back on. We had a prolonged fight earlier this year over a couple of bills called PIPA and SOPA, where there were some people in the government that felt like it was time to control the internet and the content that was on the internet. So we spent a lot of time dealing with these innovation issues, which are really internet freedom issues. So for me, in a nutshell, internet freedom means maintaining the internet as the most powerful engine perhaps we've ever seen, the most powerful engine of economic progress and social progress, and not letting any of these well-intended but disrupted interests shut down the promise the internet offers.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca Arbogast unfortunately could not make it from Comcast today, but she did send an unofficial, unscientific, that's the disclaimer, survey about what people thought internet freedom was. And I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from that. I think my favorite, I'll start with that. I know you're supposed to start with your least favorite first, but it is complex, it can create hope, it can create fear. Two of the most complicated human emotions that underlie a lot of motivations. And I have the God-given right to criticize whoever I want without having the courage to put my real name on my comments. The last part is a joke, mostly. The unabated flow of packets from end to end, information packets. I could write all night on this and still make no sense. So that underlines a little bit of the complexity that we have here, with all the different issues coming together in the creation of this kind of culture. So
there's one there that's really good.
What's that?
I mean, the uninterrupted flow of packets from end to end.
I thought that was pretty good. Yeah.
That works for me.
Very rational, very cut and dried. It's the packets.
So on that, there's an interesting book just out by Chris Yu. The title is I don't have the title memorized. That goes into the change in the network over the last decade or so, where more and more. So the original internet was pretty simple engineering, end to end, move the bits from one place to another. Now there are more devices of different kinds. There are more access points of very different kinds. The problems in trying to connect someone wirelessly, the technical engineering problems to wireless connections, very different from DSL or cable. All these different connections mean that the internet is going to run differently in his argument than it did in the past. And so that engineering principle of end-to-end, which I like and I think is the right principle, may have to be derogated from in some cases.
But we're going to have to do something to maintain it, I think. I mean, back when Mitch Capor and I first founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we'd been at it for a little while before I got an email from somebody in what was still the Soviet Union saying, well, that's all very good for you trying to preserve your First Amendment on the internet, but we don't have one. And we realized that the First Amendment was a local ordinance in cyberspace, and that the only way that we were actually going to be able to guarantee rights, since it was a difficult to regulate environment, was to focus on the architecture. The architecture is critical, and there are a lot of things that you can do. I mean, politics is architecture in cyberspace, and there's a lot of things you can do to keep that architecture open.
The book is The Dynamic Internet. I remembered while he was speaking. Dynamic Internet by Chris Yu, please.
And this brings up the complexity because there's a lot that is user-mediated. I choose to have an iPhone, a more restricted platform, or an Android phone, which is more open, or to use a laptop which connects to other networks in a different way. And those are all my user choices. There are also, of course, technical there are technical constraints, but part of the question here is what's the ideal? I can say, okay, wireless has some technical constraints, but I can also say, ideally, wireless should be as open as possible up to the end user, and the end user connects whatever device he or she wants, or should be open with regard to the content or any of these things. And those are not inconsistent with an idea of a dynamic and changing internet. What they are potentially inconsistent with is a approach which says, well, if you own the network, you can do whatever you want with it, regardless of whether there are alternative networks, whether there are choices and ways to circumvent you, and regardless of your impact on the other networks that may or may not interconnect with yours. And again, I go back to the telephone system, where one of its great virtues was you could use it, and it was, from the end user perspective, a good, fairly reliable and fairly universal system that had something of an end-to-end principle that we said the network operator couldn't interrupt my phone call for his or her own purposes. And part of the question we have in the digital freedom debate is, so is a restriction on, or a limitation on the network operator, a restraint on digital freedom, an enhancement of digital freedom, and under what circumstances? Because we might not care in a universe with lots of network providers, and more or less than we might care in a universe with relatively few network providers.
Well, so let's bring up legislation, because I think that's really relevant. So SOPA, PIPA, ACTA, WICIT, I mean, there's the veritable alphabet soup of legislation. But basically it boils down to intellectual property versus freedom and censorship. That's at its very base, the debate. So let's hear from Michael. Intellectual property. Tell us about it.
Sure. And I represent the technology industry, right? So we are an intellectual property industry. We invent stuff. That's what we do. So we are very conscious of the necessity to protect intellectual property while also leaving room for innovation. And there are ample ways to do this. There are ample ways to do this without harming legitimate businesses on the internet. There's some legislation that's been introduced that would specifically and narrowly go after bad guys who are operating abroad, who are flagrantly engaging in counterfeiting and so on. So it's not zero sum. But I do think the PIPA and SOPA experience was kind of a watershed experience, because historically in Washington, intellectual property and copyright has been this kind of backwater. It's been done kind of in back rooms by specific committees. The public hasn't really paid a lot of attention to it. It's impenetrable stuff. You say the word copyright, people's eyes glaze over. So
let me interrupt you just for a second here. Who here has heard of SOPA, PIPA, ACTA, etc.? Okay, so some of you, but not
that side of the room.
Not everyone. So just
Right, and these were bills that essentially would have allowed individuals to sue third parties on the internet who were acting as conduits for information, and would have made it much more difficult, for existing businesses like Facebook or Twitter or eBay, or to start businesses like that, and basically would have shifted how the internet worked. But this has been going on, so it's been this kind of backwater for years. And basically the ones who were represented in the process were the existing interests, basically the incumbent industries. And this year, a crazy thing happened. A bill was introduced that was very, very restrictive, and again would have shifted the balance in the internet and made it much more difficult for legitimate businesses. And 15 million Americans contacted their member of Congress, which is unheard of on any issue, much less copyright issues. There were people in Congress saying they didn't get these many calls in the healthcare debate. So clearly something has shifted. And I think what shifted was there was an existing narrative, right, where Congress's approval is very low. Right, so people don't like Congress. But there's a prevailing feeling on the right and the left that somehow the system is being gamed for the purpose of the incumbents and to disadvantage everybody else. The Tea Party people basically believe that. The Occupy people basically believe that. And number three, people love the internet. They love it. So when people were told that the Congress you don't like, is about to break the internet, which you love, at the behest of a few existing interests, they got very, very angry. And I think it was a watershed moment. And there's a different reaction now to internet issues and technology issues in Congress, where I think it used to be kind of cute for members of Congress to not know about technology. You know, series of tubes. It was funny, like, you know, your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. But then it turned around and bit them hard. And now members of Congress have decided that it is no longer cool not to know about technology, because obviously this is something their constituents really care about. So we have a window of opportunity to educate members of Congress on digital culture, on the internet, on technology, on how it works. And you know, we are doing our best to do that so that next time there is a PIPA or a SOPA or some internet breaking bill introduced, the result will be different and it won't be such a difficult fight from the outset.
You can tell who loves the internet the most because they're the ones with their faces in their devices. I love it a lot, but I'm not going to tweet from the stage.
We see you guys up here.
So intellectual property is an interesting area because people are undecided. There's legitimate debate about whether intellectual property, particularly copyright for these purposes, is something that is a right to own, like physical property. We're used to conventional rights in that area, or whether it's a government-granted monopoly. So depending on your perspective, you might think that violating intellectual property rights should be your right, because you should be free to use your faculties however you want. Other people obviously believe that intellectual property is a right to have, and so you're violating others' rights when you move it around. I'm kind of curious to hear from John Perry Barlow what his thinking on intellectual property is, because he's one of the sages of the internet generation.
Well, I think it's an oxymoron. I mean, I have no problem with the idea of property. I just like to restrict it to things that you can't reproduce infinitely at zero cost. The use of property for ideas is actually a very recent development. I mean, the term intellectual property didn't exist 30 years ago. What you got when you got a copyright was a limited license over a fairly short period of time to express something in the mechanical means that were then available. And you created an economy that dealt in the objects that you embedded expression in. And the problem is that, you know, suddenly you still have the wine, but the bottles have gone away. And the people that were in the bottling business don't know anything about the wine business, actually. And what they do know is that in the bottling business, there was this nice, tidy relationship between scarcity and value that exists with all hard goods. Suddenly, that no longer exists, and in fact, there's a relationship between familiarity and value. I mean, I could have the Hope Diamond in my pocket, and it would still be worth a lot of money, because there's only one of them. I could have the best song in the world in my head, and as long as I left it there, it would be absolutely valueless. And the institutions that have grown up around supposedly owning human thought are very interested in maintaining that ownership. There's a lot of money involved, though not as much as people seem to think. What's really critical is that the people in the content industry have been very clever about their lobbying efforts, in whether it was in D.C. or in Geneva or Maastricht or wherever. They managed to buy access to such an extent that it's just generally thought to be mother, God, and apple pie to let people own speech. You cannot own free speech. I made a good chunk of my living as a songwriter, and I'd have to say that the best thing that we ever did in the Grateful Dead was to recognize that we didn't own this stuff, and thereby invented viral marketing, kind of somewhat inadvertently.
And did not business method patent it.
I'm glad that you brought music up, because music is a huge part of the debate. But even Neil Young said in January, Piracy is the new radio.
It's musicians are not the people that are against are against copyright violation.
But they're made out to be that way.
Oh, I know. I mean, but you know, copyright is actually an excellent way of taking our productive value away from us and putting it in the hands of people that didn't make it in the first place. You know, I mean, the first thing that a record company does with your so-called intellectual property is to own it themselves and to usurp your right to have it or control it.
There are two things that have really gotten very out of whack in our current system, and they collide very forcefully with just about every single notion of digital freedom that we have. One is this question of how much do you get to control and what should the aspects of that be? It was one thing when we were talking about the words to a song, and we had a neat idea which we called the idea-expression dichotomy, which is, you know, John and I could both have the same general idea about a song we'd want to write. We could both sit here and kind of write it out. He would do a much better job of it, but I couldn't stop him if I finished first because my expression of it was very different from his expression of it, and letting him have an exclusive right to his expression of that idea doesn't stop me from having a different expression of the same idea. When you talk about the software in a cell phone, and or any kind of written thing that does stuff, you start to get into the real problem of, well, we no longer have a difference between idea and expression. This is the idea, the written form becomes the expression and becomes an actuality. So we're applying these things and using them in ways that limit what people can do in a way that was never true before. The other problem is, what do you do about this? And that has gotten seriously out of whack as well. The biggest problems with SOPA and PIPA were not that anybody said, oh, stealing is good. There is nobody out there at this point who is saying, yeah, stealing is good.
There might be a few.
The question is really much more, what do you do to try to address this, and who ought to bear the cost? I like to say, look, everybody agrees shoplifting is bad, but we don't think you ought to give mall cops machine guns and have them gun down anybody who looks suspicious, or that there ought to be a right to strip search you coming into and out of a mall just in case you're shoplifting something.
I would go further and say you haven't stolen anything from me if I still have it.
Yeah. So what can the average layperson do about digital freedom?
Join EFF.
And support public knowledge.
And support the Cato Institute.
And the Cato, yes. Yes.
I mean, unfortunately, you just...
Where can people go to become more informed? Obviously your websites, but where can they go? What can they read? What could they do? Because I think that's part of it. I mean, people tend to tune out when they feel like they can't make a difference somehow, or they can't make an impact. But yet, the internet was created by people who just wanted the system, right? It's still that way for the most part. But that's being challenged. So how can people keep it that way?
One of the problems that we've had, and we've had this all along, is that the issues, I mean, because they are very technical. They're so nerdy.
But nerdy's cool these days.
Well, but I mean, nerdy's hard, too. And by the time people understand the dimensions of the problem, by the time you've actually been able to communicate to people that what, for example, SOPA and PIPA would have done was to make it so that any content owner could sort of arbitrarily deny you your right to an IP address, which, first of all, people have to understand what an IP address is and why that's important. But I mean, we've constantly grappled with the fact that by the time the public becomes aware and it has a full understanding of the dimensions of the problem, it's generally been settled one way or the other, and it has to get settled early, or you've lost it. It's a very difficult problem. I mean, it essentially requires you to put a great deal of your faith in engineers.
I'll say that, I mean, it's easier than ever to inform yourself about what's going on, which is a good thing. And organizations like ours, chances are, if you hear it's going to break the internet from any of the organizations represented up here, it's probably true, and you should say the same thing over and over again to all of your friends so that movements like the one against SOPA and PIPA happen again. I'll share a little bit on digital democracy, though, which is an increasing interest of mine. Look around you and how the internet has affected so many different industries. Book selling, we know Amazon. The media business totally changed. All the businesses that are in the Consumer Electronics Association constantly battling with the internet as a disruptive force. What's the major industry in society that hasn't been affected that way by the internet? It's governing. And that's really, in my opinion, because the data isn't there. You can't go and figure out what's happening in Washington, D.C. the way you can figure out what's happening with the Major League Baseball or any other sport. You get good data in the newspaper every day about baseball, for crying out loud. You get good data every day about the weather in the newspaper. You get good data, should you still read a newspaper. You get good data about the investments and finance. But good data about what's happening in Washington isn't there. So I've been doing, that's a little bit of a sidelight to digital freedom, but I'm doing a lot of work on digitizing legislative process, digitizing budgetary process, so that it can make its way out into the internet and make it easier for all of us to fight for digital freedom or whatever interests we prefer.
If government didn't feel threatened by the internet, Julian Assange wouldn't be in the Ecuadorian embassy at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a couple of things here. There's first what people in this room can do as opposed to sort of the more general public, because people who are in this room have a unique opportunity because of the unique position that you all are in. As a general rule, I tell people, look, one of the costs of being an actual citizen is, unfortunately, you got to keep up with stuff. And even if it means you're not going to keep up with every little detail, it does mean you have to figure out who to trust so that when you get alerts about things, you know, okay, this is an important issue of mine. These are people who I trust, not to, call me up every other day with yet another crisis. They save it for when they need it. That's how you can stay connected and make it known, to your state legislator, because a lot of this stuff also happens on the state level, federal legislators, that you care about this stuff and you're watching. The people in this room, however, I want to say you got an opportunity to do a lot more for whatever varying definitions of internet freedom that we have. With regard to the copyright and also patent issues that we've discussed, you are uniquely in a position to weigh in. One of the reasons why certain things get moved along so quickly is that nobody in Washington hears from other interests, other CEOs who say, this would really suck for us. Just because even if it's just because we're using the internet and this is going to make it that much harder for us to connect with our customers, it's going to increase our compliance costs, and why the hell should we have to pay for stuff that isn't likely to help in the piracy fight anyway, and it's going to do serious harm. So there's an opportunity to step up. There's also an opportunity to support within your own businesses and extending into your communities things like access. Rebecca's not here, but I promised her that I would plug Comcast's Internet Essentials program, where Comcast is now doing a lot to provide internet for low-income families. That started as an offer to the Federal Communications Commission to let them close a merger, but now they've discovered that that's really a good thing to do. And there's something that the FCC is sponsoring called the Connect to Compete program, which is a voluntary program with regard to trying to get people connected. There are equipment recycling programs that get the necessary equipment for access into the hands of people who really need it. And even within a given business, there are a lot of opportunities. In the same way there are a lot of green opportunities, there are also a lot of internet freedom opportunities with regard to what kind of business path you take and what kind of vendors you choose to support and what countries you choose to deal with and how you express to them potential concerns about their internet policies. So I make a pitch to all of you here, if this is something that you think is important, whether or not you think it's an actual right or just something good, you do have the capacity to take it back home and really weigh in a meaningful way. And it's usually good business, too.
Yeah, and let me just add, the reason that PIPA and SOPA failed isn't because members of Congress woke up one morning, said, you know, I've been thinking about this, and I've decided that breaking the internet to preserve incumbent business models really isn't a smart move for America's innovation and cultural future. That didn't happen. The reason PIPA and SOPA failed was because members of Congress got so many calls coming into their switchboard was shut down for 2 days. And that frightened them. And all of a sudden, you saw a lot of members switching position on these bills. So the lesson is you got to get engaged. You got to stay engaged. You got 3 groups on this panel that are doing outstanding work in Internet freedom. Electronic Freedom Foundation, Public Knowledge, Cato Institute. They're all fantastic. We have a group at CEA called the Innovation Movement you may want to check out. Let me also plug a group called Fight for the Future. Check them out. They're doing wonderful things. If you want to stay involved, there's a daily email alert, a blog called Techdirt. It was written by a guy named Mike Masnick. He does phenomenal reporting on this stuff. But you got to be engaged. And what happened on PIPA and SOPA wasn't a unique thing. A few months ago, the D.C. City Council tried to ban Uber for the first time. And once again, their switchboard was shut down for a day. And that backed them off for a while. There was a terrible intellectual property treaty that we were a restrictive intellectual property treaty the U.S. was trying to force on Europe. And it got rejected by the EU because they got so many calls coming in from their citizens. So there's a saying that the problem with these issues is the future doesn't have a lobbyist. So you've got to be that lobbyist. And it's the right thing to do, and it's good business. So I would just encourage you as CEOs, as business leaders, as thought leaders, to get engaged, be public, stay engaged, contact your member of Congress, get to know your member of Congress, and be engaged on these digital freedom issues. Because it is going to be a constant issue. It is going to be a constant threat. Again, innovation is disruptive. Nobody likes to be disrupted. These issues are not going away, and it is very important for you to stay engaged.
There's another thing. I think probably everybody in this room wants to have free trade. And they've come up with these wonderful stalking horses for internet control, and one of them is currently being negotiated. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's being done almost entirely in secrecy, and it's supposed to be an opening of free trade around the Pacific Rim. It generally appears to have values that most companies that are in the stuff business would have no problem with. It is also incredibly censorious, at least the drafts that we've been able to get out from underneath the secret process of so-called intellectual property, and requires, in order for you to be a participant in free trade, for you to be aggressively pursuing copyright violations.
Yeah, I mean, this is
as a country,
where the problem in our international trade negotiations has been that Hollywood drives the crazy train, and it's now driving it over a cliff. The United States spent years negotiating the ACTA Treaty, which was mostly about how do we keep people from having counterfeit medicines, counterfeit, goods, the fake Louis Vuitton handbags and that sort of thing that pretty much everybody agreed on. What made Europe reject it as a human rights violation was because Hollywood held this treaty up for 3 years, demanding that really crazy stuff go into it with regard to the internet and their vision of what they thought was necessary to fight digital piracy. Even when it was whittled down to just modestly crazy, as opposed to super crazy, that was still too much for the world to swallow. We're now trying to negotiate this free trade access to what everybody agrees are the most important markets in the Asian Pacific region. This is where the next realm of free trade is coming up. And once again, Hollywood is driving the crazy train. And the question is, are people who are not just the folks here on this stage, but or industry associations like the consumer electronics folks, but are other industries who want to see free trade, who think that's an important element of freedom, going to stand up and say, no, we're not going to let Hollywood drive this agreement off a cliff?
I like the phrase Hollywood drives a crazy train, but I have such a positive association with that because of the Ozzy Osbourne song that there's a challenge there in the talking points. But I'd like to bring up another one of the stalking horses, and I think that's a good way of thinking about it that John Perry Barlow used. And that's cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is being touted by our authorities in Washington as the top reason, among the top reasons, along with intellectual property protection, for getting their mitts on important parts of the internet. And I think it's very concerning. Most people in Washington, just like most people around the nation, don't know how this stuff works. We use it all the time, but we don't know the details of how it works. And so we're quite susceptible to hear from authorities that there are attacks that will cause blood to run in the streets. That's a quote. Cyber Pearl Harbors, cyber Katrinas, these kinds of things. Not having any concrete knowledge ourselves as non-technical people, most of us, we don't know to say that that's not true. But if you study it carefully, I think it's pretty clear that it's not true. Cyber attacks are a genuine security problem. It's a host of different security problems, which is important to recognize. The solution is probably actually to assign responsibility properly rather than to try to centralize with the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Defense how to fix all these things. But the claims that we will suffer dramatic effects from cyber attacks are overwrought, but our politicians are falling for them hook, line, and sinker. General Keith Alexander, who's the head of the National Security Agency, spoke at the American Enterprise Institute during the height of the debate a couple of months ago, and he comes off really cool and amiable and everything else, and he's talking about all we need is an IP address and a little bit of signaling information and another IP address. That's about all we need. But at the same time, the bills he's pushing in Congress say that any information sharing for cybersecurity purposes shall be legal, notwithstanding any other law. Any information can be shared with the government for cybersecurity purposes, whatever that means. So that means that health privacy laws don't apply. That means the Electronic Communications Privacy Act doesn't apply. That means contracts don't apply. It means tort law doesn't apply, because Congress may say that notwithstanding any other law, information for cybersecurity purposes can be shared with the National Security Agency inside the Department of Defense. This is crazy stuff. The NSA is driving a crazy train, I tell you. That's a threat to our freedom.
Well, so this brings up the question, is it ever appropriate, is it ever okay for government to interrupt service?
I don't think so.
We have seen, it was very interesting last year because we had folks in Tahrir Square and other places around the globe who were using mobile services and access to the internet to organize and get their story out. And when it was in Egypt or it's in Aleppo, everybody was for it. And then just a couple of months later, we had some riots in London, and we had some potential protests in San Francisco over the shooting of a homeless person on the BART. And suddenly, what was really awful, horrible human rights violation over there was totally cool over here because our guys are somehow different. And that's the real problem. If you tell me, there's a cell phone activated bomb in a defined geographic area and therefore we need to interrupt cell phone service while we find the bomb, okay. But if you tell me that it's bad because somebody is going to tweet out, police are beating the crap out of protesters, avoid Zuccotti Park. How is that a different form of speech than police are beating the crap out of protesters, avoid Tahrir Square? Whether you think that the protests were the same, the speech about what is happening is critically important. And once we start saying, well, it's free speech in Tahrir Square, it's not free speech over here in the United States because our police are different, then we are having a real problem, both internally for us and what the rest of the world frankly thinks of us and our ideals, which we are trying to promote.
John Perry, you had a very simple answer to this, so.
I don't think it's supportable for the government to stop any form of communication, here or anywhere else. And I also think that it's impractical. If you want to have functional systems of governance, they have to be able to communicate with each other. If you want to have functional business, it has to be able to communicate unimpeded. And if you want to have liberty, you cannot stop people from communicating. I mean, it seems very straightforward to me. But there are the 4 stalking horses of the apocalypse, and terrorism is one of them. Copyright and kiddie porn and drugs. But I mean, terrorism, people in the United States are clearly willing to do damn near anything in order to stop a threat that actually turns out statistically to be far less dangerous than lightning storms are to golfers, in terms of its annual kill rate. I don't know what kind of, it's not just, we're all on a crazy train in this country. I mean, we have gone completely sideways.
We need Ozzy here. Michael?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add is that the United States generally has been very good at preserving a free and open and untrammeled with internet. And we really are the example to the world in that regard. And that's something we've got to be very conscious of, because other countries look to us as an example. And, if you do things like cutting off access, if you do things like, through PIPA and SOPA or other legislation, actively censoring internet content, then other countries are going to look at us and say, well, if it's, certainly if it's okay with the United States, then that gives us a green light to do it. We are very unique in the world as far as the protection that we accord free speech. I'm not just talking about despotic regimes, but for example, in the United Kingdom, there are very strong rules about being able to name public figures in public. In France, there are very strong rules about being able to sell certain things on eBay or certain brands or World War II artifacts and so on. So even among democratic countries, the United States really stands out for the protection that we afford free speech. And that's something we've got to maintain. Right now there's a campaign being mounted by some in the United Nations to have the United Nations essentially take over internet governance, which we think, and I probably trust I'm probably joined by the folks on this panel, we think is a very bad idea, because right now the way it works ensures that degree of freedom. And the United States, frankly, provides an umbrella that protects that kind of freedom. And if it were moved out of that context, it wouldn't. So we need to be conscious of the fact that we are giving an example, and we are basically setting a template on these issues for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think that we definitely have the common ground of, we all think that it is a priority, digital freedom. So I'd like to open it up to the audience.
Shocking.
I know, right?
All in favor?
It's very controversial. So I'd love to hear from the audience, and especially those members, corporations. There's a gentleman in the back there.
I think there's a man with a mic here.
And a man with a mic.
Is it on? You guys were talking about the Cybersecurity Act, and I understand that last week Senator Lieberman advised the President and the White House to issue an executive order to essentially legislate it by presidential decree. What do we do in that situation?
You should be grateful for the fact that Joe Lieberman will eventually leave Congress.
Yeah. Well, part of it is that the question of what authority the president has to issue such an executive order comes up. And it really is sort of the first question that people ought to ask or say, okay, the president has power to issue executive orders that say what federal workers ought to do, or in certain other cases. But if you were going to issue an executive order that tried to do what this legislation does, you'd have to ask, under what authority are you doing that? And I would hope that the White House would pause to consult some of its lawyers and would discover that it doesn't have any. I do think that one of the things that was extraordinarily effective when SOPA and PIPA were out there was that people reacted. And one of the things also that's important is if the White House issues such an executive order, then regardless of whether people think it has real authority or not, there ought to be a tremendous outcry about it. Because if the White House issues an executive order and we hear crickets in Washington, then Congress is going to come back next year and say, all right, well, turns out cybersecurity doesn't create the same reaction that SOPA did, so here we go.
Let me say a couple of things. One, to those of you from Connecticut, your senator is driving the crazy train. But more seriously, so the Harold's right that the president has limited authority to do some of the worst stuff that is being considered in legislation, which might actually split the cybersecurity liberties-oriented coalition, because a lot of the objection to cybersecurity legislation has been based on the privacy concerns. I have just as much regulatory concerns. That is, how is it that this federal government, which has as many cybersecurity problems as everybody else and maybe more, is going to figure out how to solve all these different problems? I would much rather have the problem distributed to the owners of the infrastructure, and 90 whatever percent, pick your number, is privately owned infrastructure. Assign responsibility. Make sure that businesses that fail to secure their own stuff, they lose. They should lose. No bailout. But we don't want to centralize it, and I fear that the privacy coalition will fall away in the context of an executive order, because the federal government is going to fake it till they make it. That is, they're going to act like they have the regulatory authority until they get the regulatory authority. I don't think security will be any better when they do.
Over the last decade, though, the White House has shown the ability and the desire to routinely do things that it isn't authorized to do. I mean, the White House has basically done away with habeas corpus. They've made it possible for the NSA to wiretap without a warrant practically everybody in the United States all the time. I mean, the people are not rising up at all in the face of what is a fairly serious curtailment of what ought to be fundamental liberties.
Between now and November 5th, November 6th, the voice of the people rising up will never be stronger. And people have, this is when elected officials are listening most carefully to what are the hot button issues that people are talking about. Both parties felt that this was enough of a hot button issue to put internet freedom planks in their platforms, which was a major step. And I think that this is really the time to make it very clear that cybersecurity is not an excuse to fundamentally mess with the internet, whether that's mess with its infrastructure or mess with our right to use it.
So back to what you can do. Right, you have a member of Congress who right now is trying very, very hard to get reelected. And I'd be willing to bet that over the next 4 weeks, he or she will be having a town hall meeting within 10 miles of your house. So take a night, make it a night out, go to dinner afterwards, show up at the town hall, have some drinks afterwards, and show up, express your concerns about the cybersecurity bill, and ask your member of Congress what he or she plans to do to protect your freedom on the internet.
And
because
bring
again,
your friends.
as Harold said, this, for the first time, this is kind of a stunning thing, this issue ended up in both the Republican and Democratic Party platforms in near identical language, which is kind of neat. So the issue was on their radar screens. And again, I think the whole PIPA and SOFA thing was a transformative experience for them, where they realized this is a big deal. So you got to keep on reinforcing this message, and the next month is the ideal time to reinforce it.
There's a question. The microphone is there.
Yeah, I've got the mic. I got the conch.
The scepter.
I'm Greg Stein with Sustain Edge. I come with this question from the standpoint that I firmly believe that the internet is a human right. It's a basic human right no matter where you live. A few things that have kind of developed over the years I just want to throw out there. Things from we've already talked about cyber warfare and interference with the transmission of data by sovereign governments, threats to net neutrality. Interesting that Comcast is not here. I'd like to hear their comments on that after being beat up on that a few years. rogue agents within organizations like Anonymous, privatization of data by companies like Google, and something that is truly alarming to me is the collaboration between Kaspersky and Putin. Are all of these things sort of temporary manipulations of the internet, or are you seeing that these are adding up to being a permanent subversion of our global network?
Well, I think we're in a stage where a lot of people are testing what you can get away with. The norms that we are establishing now of what's a reasonable thing to do and what's an unreasonable thing to do are very much in flux. I want to take the point about despotic governments, because this is where we get to the ITU, WICIT, which is coming up. WICIT stands for the World Conference on Information Technology, which will be in Dubai at the beginning of December, where a number of governments, including the Russian consortium, have wanted to amend the Global Treaty on Telecommunications to not only include internet, but also to say it's okay to disrupt service for security reasons in the same way they can right now for telephone service. And if that is successful, then they will have established a global norm that disruption of service is one of the things a sovereign can do. Right now, we have a lot of sovereign countries and a lot of international jurisdictions and jurisdictions in the United States who are looking at that as a human rights violation. If they are successful at getting this adopted, then that goes from human rights violation to maybe something we don't like, but something which is potentially okay. So I think in the next couple of years, we need to be alert to all of these things as we settle what the norms for the internet ought to be.
You know, to try to give a broader answer to your question, though, I've been fighting these wars at increasingly grand scales for over 20 years. And at that point, I felt like the internet was put all of humanity in this very weird position where a future of greater freedom and access to knowledge was being promised at the same time that the world's most invasive surveillance system was being promised. And the tug back and forth between these two things has been running at zero sum as far as I can see. I mean, I think we've lost some, we've won some. I remain optimistic. I think that they can do what they want in Dubai. I'd love to see them enforce it.
If I could just add, the issues change, but the themes remain the same. About 20 years ago, one of our colleagues on this panel, John Barlow, wrote an article, and it was called Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace. And this should be, if you haven't read it, read it. Like, this is your required reading for today. Because everything that has come to pass about the tension between the internet and incumbent industries and the tension between the internet and government and the likely reaction, everything that was predicted, that John predicted 20 years ago, has come to pass. And it's an ongoing issue and it's an ongoing challenge. And I think, as everybody was saying, we've done okay. But it reminds me of the famous story after the Constitutional Convention, when, after days and days, Ben Franklin finally walked out of the convention hall in Philadelphia, and a woman stopped him and said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you created for us?" And he said, "A democracy, ma'am, if you can keep it." And I think that's what the internet is. It is this tremendous mechanism for innovation and human progress, if we can keep it, and we got to keep it.
I'll say that I agree with John Perry Barlow being optimistic, because I think the internet sort of defaults toward freedom. John Gilmore, who's another EFF founder, if I remember correctly, he said that the internet regards censorship as damage and routes around it. And that's a sort of metaphor for the internet and the internet ecosystem, which is very difficult to capture and control. But, yeah, read John Perry Barlow's essay. The old governments of flesh and steel are not going gently into that good night. They're doing everything they can to retain power. And they're using their control over, when they can get it, they're using their control over ISPs. They're using it for surveillance. They're using it for all kinds of purposes in order to maintain that power. So we're looking, I think a lot of folks on this panel look at this as a long-term battle for power. Will power centralize with governments, making the internet the #1 surveillance system ever created? or will power decentralize out to people? I want it to decentralize out to people. I think it will decentralize out to people. But we all, I think, have to make sure that that happens, and it's a very important battle.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
Dr. Adal Hussain with World Liberty TV. My question is very simple for each one of the panelists. Who owns the internet?
You do. He does. She does.
The question lacks a meaningful referent for a meaningful response.
But you know, actually, here's an important point. The internet is owned in its many parts and pieces by a lot of different institutions, generally speaking. I mean, the lines of transmission. And in many cases, there is at minimum a duopoly between the way in which you can get internet service where you are. And you can deal with two entities that are much too censorious. I mean, I'm sorry Comcast isn't here, because I'd like to ask them why they think that it is their right to stop my access from Pirate Bay or to Pirate Bay as a customer, which, you know, they can certainly do as a private entity. Terms of service are not guarantees of rights at all. And so I think it's important to ask who owns the internet. But fortunately, you can do a lot to foster free trade in bits. I think that's the important consideration. You can try to force the issue and make sure that there is real competition, and that you're not stuck with a couple of providers.
Luckily, the reading assignments we're handing down from the dais are relatively short. And there's another reading assignment I'll give you. It's called World of Ends. I think it's at worldofends.com or .org. Search World of Ends, you'll find it. And it describes the internet as an agreement. The internet's an agreement to use a protocol. And that's the kind of big answer that a big question like that gets. The pieces of the internet, the different layers of the internet, they're mostly owned by private actors. When someone adds their stuff onto the internet, that's now part of the internet, but it's still theirs. That agreement to use this protocol is what's done all the magic. And nobody's going to own an agreement. Luckily, nobody owns the protocol, and that's why it's been so valuable.
Well, and we do have to, we're running out of time, we do have to stop, but with great ownership comes great responsibility. So it's all of our responsibility to keep digital freedom alive. Thank you.